Welcome to Colicchio's Classroom, where this week we'll discuss economics. Teachers, does this kind of sound like your classroom? Oh my god, economics is so boring. Does supply go up or does demand? I can never remember. Numbers are hard.
Bueller.
Well, what if I told you that economics would lead to the rise of dictators and result in millions of people unemployed and dead? It's not so boring now. So this week's episode is going to be about the aptly named Great Depression. Maybe why it was not so great. Seriously, they could have come up with a better adjective. So let's talk about the causes. Whenever anyone talks about the causes of the Great Depression, people always go to the US stock market collapse of 1929. And yes, that was one of the major causes, but ultimately it wasn't the biggest one. History tends to be a little, American-centric. What do you mean, man? America is so awesome. We're #1. Rich people would say it was, but that's only because they lost about $40 billion in the course of 1929 alone. There were more underlying causes of the Great Depression. World War I, that lasted from 1914 to 1919, was arguably one of the biggest causes of the Depression. Nations were weaved into this web of debt. Germany owed money because of the atrocious Treaty of Versailles and the reparations from that. Great Britain and France and the other allies owed the United States money from Lend-Lease. So the US started giving out loans to Germany to pay back those reparations. But they also started collecting on the allies from the Lend-Lease. But due to all these heavy reparations and cost of losing its colonies, Germany's economy suffered, and they weren't really able to pay those debts to the allies, and therefore weren't able to pay us back for Lend-Lease. In the US and Europe alike, wealth really wasn't distributed well, leading to an increasing wage gap between the rich and poor. Now in the US, this meant that people could not always afford to pay for the items that were being produced, and in fact they were overproduced. Factories were overproducing items because of World War I. This led to many consumers buying things on credit, and especially farmers. When the stock market crashed in 1929, it set off a chain reaction of these awful events worldwide, starting with the US and with many banks closing due to the fact that people started withdrawing their savings that they lost in the stock market. Because banks weren't insured federally, thanks Andrew Jackson, people were actually denied their own money, and of course the banks started to close, which means that businesses took a really big hit, meaning they couldn't take out loans, meaning they couldn't hire more people. Businesses started to lose money. They began to lay off workers and eventually close themselves. In response, President Herbert Hoover passed a number of laws that gave banks the money they needed, and businesses were bailed out, and the Depression had ended before it started. Now wait, that actually didn't happen. It was the opposite. Hoover was very fiscally conservative and decided to let it last, saying that the economy would eventually recover and that people would be fine. Big spoiler here, it didn't. He did eventually try to get some public works and government spending, like building, the Hoover Dam, but it was too late. People already had made him a scapegoat for the Depression. Now, from the US perspective, the Depression was bad, but from the world perspective, it was really bad. The US enacted the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which if you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you're like, oh no, now I remember that thing. Yeah, that's what Ben Stein was talking about. This was raising the price of foreign goods in hopes to improve America's businesses, but all that did was hurt foreign companies, dropping global trade 60%. What were the effects of the Depression? In some countries, like the United States, unemployment was as high as 30%, and in Germany, it was up to 40%. People had to take second jobs, and many became homeless, relying on food banks and bread lines. Another effect was the severe lack of trust that people had in their government. Americans hated Herbert Hoover, especially for the fact that he mishandled the bonus army of 1932, in which the army drove out World War I veterans who wanted a bonus for fighting during World War I itself. In Europe, the Depression and economic hardships opened the door for radical ideologies such as fascism and communism. Now, these ideologies promised to alleviate the economic hardships that World War I and the Depression had brought onto countries and ultimately bring peace and prosperity to their nations. Those ideologies also used minority-rich populations, such as Jews, to become scapegoats for their problems. Now, the Great Depression maybe wasn't so great. Now, could it have been prevented? Well, that's kind of impossible to say. John Maynard Keynes predicted the Depression after sitting on the Economic Council for the Treaty of Versailles. He warned the Allied nations about punishing Germany too severely, stating, "We aim at the impoverishment of Central Europe. Vengeance, I dare say, will not limp. Nothing can delay for very long the forces of reaction and the despairing convulsions of revolution, before which the horrors of the later German war will fade into nothing, and which will destroy whoever is victor, the civilization and progress of our generations." We should have listened to the boring economists after all. Thanks for watching.